Content warning. This episode contains descriptions of domestic violence, including abuse by serving police officers. It may be distressing to some listeners. If you or someone you know needs help, contact 1-800-RESPECT, 1-800-737-732, Lifeline 131114, Aboriginal Family Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-019-123. These stories are real. They are shared with consent, they are backed by evidence, and they deserve to be heard. You're listening to The Deep Dive, a podcast by Underground Media Network. Each deep dive, we go beyond headlines and dig into the truths that institutions want buried, from police abuse and political cover-ups to survivor-led resistance. This is not opinion. This is evidence. This is not mainstream. This is journalism with teeth. I'm your host, The Illuminator.
And I'm the Architect.
We are investigative journalists for Underground Media Network.
Together, we follow the facts wherever they lead, no matter the risk.
Let's dive in. Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive that really pulls back the curtain on something profoundly important and, deeply uncomfortable. Today, we're tackling an issue that touches the very core of trust and safety in our communities: domestic and family violence.
Yeah.
And specifically, particularly when the perpetrators are those sworn to uphold the law, police officers.
That's the difficult part.
It is. Our mission, as always, is to take a stack of critical sources. We've got everything from official government reports, internal police policies, some rigorous academic research, and also powerful direct submissions from advocacy groups, and really extract the most potent, the most important insights for you.
Right.
Think of this as maybe your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on a topic that's often shrouded in silence, institutional complexity, and, frankly, a lot of denial.
That's right. And the sources we've compiled, they paint a very clear picture, though it is unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
What's truly shocking right from the outset is understanding that domestic violence isn't just prevalent, it's widely acknowledged as the most frequently committed crime in Australia.
Yet the least reported.
Yet the least reported, exactly. And this isn't just a cold statistic, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It represents countless hidden struggles, profound suffering, and, well, a massive blind spot in our justice system.
Yeah.
And what's particularly unsettling, as our sources highlight, is the stark recognition that people in all occupations right across the board experience and, unfortunately, perpetuate domestic violence.
It cuts across everything.
It does. And this includes, unequivocally, members of our police forces. So the critical question that immediately arises, the one we'll be meticulously unpacking today, is what happens when the person committing this violence is an officer?
Right.
The very individual sworn to protect you. How does that dynamic shift? How does it complicate things? And often, how does it intensify the risks for victims?
That's a crucial distinction, isn't it? To make sure we're all on the same page for this deep dive, we're really honing in on what the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, defines as officer-involved domestic violence, or OIDV. That's any reported, confirmed, and/or prosecuted incident of domestic violence wherein a sworn police officer is the suspected offender.
So a very specific definition.
Exactly. And why is this specific definition so important? Because it helps us focus on the unique power imbalances, the profound challenges, and the very specific systemic issues that come up when law enforcement personnel are involved as suspected offenders.
Right. It's not just general DV.
No, it isn't. Though that context is always present, of course. We are specifically looking at the unique implications of an abuser wearing a badge.
Yeah. And before we go deeper, we absolutely must acknowledge that this topic is incredibly sensitive. For some listeners, it might be distressing to hear.
Definitely.
These aren't abstract concepts or, theoretical debates. These are real experiences, often harrowing, and they're backed by compelling evidence. They absolutely deserve to be heard, to be understood, and hopefully to prompt action. Our unwavering commitment throughout this deep dive is to present these facts neutrally, relying solely on the comprehensive sources provided to us. We really aim to give you a clear, evidence-based understanding of this critical issue without sensationalism, but with the full weight of the truth these sources reveal.
Okay, let's unpack this further then. Let's really dive into the stark reality of officer-involved domestic violence, OIDV, and what our sources reveal about its hidden prevalence.
Hidden is the word.
It really is. It's genuinely startling to discover just how underexplored this phenomenon is, not just here in Australia, but internationally too.
Yeah, it's surprising.
Despite its acknowledged existence, despite its profound impact on individuals and, let's face it, public trust, there's a significant, almost perplexing lack of publicly available research and, crucially, official police statistics on this specific issue here in Australia.
It's like a black hole for data.
It really is. It's like there's this massive blind spot, maybe even a deliberate avoidance of data collection on such a critical issue. What's that lack of transparency even signal,
Indeed. And while comprehensive Australian data remains stubbornly elusive, and that's a point we'll definitely come back to, we do have some limited research, mostly from the United States, that provides some, well, frankly, chilling estimates.
Okay.
This U.S. research suggests that the incidence of OIDV is at least as common as it is in the general American population.
At least.
At least. But here's where it gets truly alarming. There's evidence suggesting it could be 2 to 4 times more likely to occur in the families of police officers compared to the general population.
2 to 4 times. That's huge.
It's a massive difference. And this immediately raises a crucial, uncomfortable question for us here in Australia. What would these numbers actually look like if we had similar transparency?
And why don't we?
And perhaps even more importantly, why does this specific data remain so largely inaccessible? To the public, to researchers, the very absence of this data, the fact that it's not systematically collected or publicly reported, that in itself becomes a significant part of the problem, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It allows the issue to just fester in the shadows.
Exactly.
And here's where the picture truly starts to clarify. And honestly, it's infuriating when you look at the timeline.
Yeah.
Our sources indicate that as far back as 2014, police commissioners across Australia were acutely aware of what's termed police officer domestic abuse, or PODA.
So they knew about it.
They weren't just vaguely aware, they actually had access to well-established model policies from the US and the UK for over a decade. Policies explicitly designed to guide the development of their own state or even national approaches to this very issue.
The blueprints were there.
The blueprints were there. Yet, the stark, unsettling finding from our sources is that, and I'm quoting here, nothing has happened in terms of widespread systematic implementation of these critical policies.
Wow, over a decade of models available.
And nothing has happened. Think about that for a moment. The knowledge was there, the international best practices were available, the models were ready to go, but the sustained, decisive action just wasn't taken.
So it wasn't ignorance.
Doesn't seem like it. This isn't just a simple oversight. It suggests a profound institutional unwillingness to tackle this issue head-on. It really begs the question, are the powers that be, from politicians to police unions, even within the corporate structure of the force itself, are they truly committed to fixing this?
Or is there resistance?
It certainly raises profound questions about internal priorities versus, public safety and victim well-being.
And this deeply ingrained inaction, or perhaps, as you say, deliberate slowness, it leads us directly to the profound influence of what's known as police culture.
Ah, yes, the culture.
The police force, as described in our sources, is a large, complex, quasi-military organization. And by its very nature, it fosters this unique internal culture that heavily emphasizes things like police loyalty, teamwork, defensive solidarity, conformity, and obedience to authority.
Things that can be good in some contexts.
Exactly. While these traits can be essential for effective policing, particularly in dangerous or high-pressure situations, they can also become a real double-edged sword when it comes to internal accountability, especially regarding issues as sensitive and potentially damaging as domestic violence perpetrated by one of their own.
That's such a critical distinction. And it's one that former Victorian Police Commissioner Christine Nixon articulated really well in her book, Fair Cop.
Okay.
She noted that while a strong culture is vital for unity and courage in difficult times, there's a significant danger in misplaced loyalty. As she starkly put it, this type of loyalty tries to protect police who have acted outside the law and betrays the majority of officers who actually work conscientiously to uphold the law.
So it protects the few at the expense of the many and the public.
Precisely. This isn't just about a few individual officers acting badly. It's about a deeply ingrained brotherhood mentality that can, and often does, actively undermine organizational values. It excludes those who don't conform, and most damningly, it encourages the force to close ranks to ward off scrutiny or to conceal corrupt practices.
That closing ranks is key.
It is. And this inherent cultural trait creates unique and incredibly difficult barriers for accountability when OIDV cases come to light. It actively works against the very principles of justice they are meant to uphold.
And this cultural influence starts early, doesn't it? Often subtly shaping new recruits.
So.
A 2013 survey of Queensland Police Service, QPS recruits, and first-year constables revealed a concerning trend. There was a documented negative effect on police values, knowledge, perceptions, and intention to report misconduct after just 6 months of operational duties.
Only 6 months.
6 months out of the academy. And this isn't entirely surprising when you think about how new officers are mentored. They learn from more experienced colleagues who, while perhaps well-intentioned in fostering camaraderie, might inadvertently prioritize, quote, loyalty to your mates over some of the ethical training recruits received.
The academy versus the street.
Kind of. Imagine a new constable witnessing something, maybe an inappropriate interaction by a senior officer, and being subtly encouraged by their peers to just ignore it, for the sake of team unity.
Yeah, look the other way.
This process can subtly yet powerfully erode the very ethical foundations meant to guide policing. It makes internal reporting of misconduct, including something as serious as domestic violence, incredibly difficult. It creates a self-reinforcing cycle of silence, really.
So if the institutional culture itself presents such a formidable barrier, just imagine the unique, almost unbearable vulnerability faced by victims of OIDV.
It's hard to fathom.
Our sources highlight an utter lack of confidence in the police response among these victims. They harbor a profound and entirely justifiable fear that the service would look after its own.
It's not paranoia, is it?
Absolutely not. It's a terrifying reality when your abuser is part of the very system designed to protect you, the system you would normally turn to for help. This fear can lead to intense isolation, profound vulnerability, and a deep sense of powerlessness, precisely because the perpetrator is an officer who is expected to enforce domestic violence laws.
The irony is just brutal.
It's palpable. As palpable as the danger. How can you possibly escape when your protector is your abuser?
And this fear, it isn't just emotional or psychological, is it? It creates very real, practical barriers to safety that are almost unimaginable for other victims of domestic violence.
Like what?
Well, victims of police perpetrators face truly unique and terrifying questions. For instance, how can they protect themselves and their children if they can't trust the police enough to report the violence?
A fundamental dilemma.
And will they be believed or taken seriously by the perpetrator's fellow officers? These aren't rhetorical questions. They represent immediate life-threatening dilemmas.
Yeah.
Furthermore, one of the most chilling insights from our sources is the real threat that if the perpetrator has access to police systems,
Which they do.
they might know where all the refuges are, effectively turning traditional escape routes into potential traps.
Oh, it's terrifying.
It's a level of strategic, systemic control that most domestic violence victims simply do not face. It makes their escape incredibly precarious.
And what's even more disturbing is the chilling effect this has on the very support agencies that are meant to help victims.
How so?
Our sources reveal that some domestic violence support agencies, even non-government organizations, are actually very reluctant to engage with research on PODA, on police officer domestic abuse.
Why would they be reluctant?
Because they worry, and perhaps rightly so, that speaking out or even actively researching this issue could antagonize the very police whom they depend upon to protect their clients.
Wow, so they're caught in a bind.
Completely. This silence, born out of a perceived necessity for their own clients' safety, it just reinforces the public perception of the brotherhood within the police force. And it creates a significant, almost insurmountable barrier to independent data collection and, critically, to comprehensive victim support.
It's a systemic entanglement.
It really is.
Huh.
Where the victim's potential lifeline is afraid to truly challenge the system that might be perpetrating the harm.
Which brings us to another terrifying aspect. The sophisticated way police perpetrators can weaponize information and systems against their victims.
Using their insider knowledge.
Exactly. These officers possess unique resources and a deep, intimate knowledge of how the system works. Our sources show they can use police intelligence databases as, and this is a direct quote, a purpose-built tool for the perpetration of gendered violence.
Purpose-built tool. That's chillin'.
It is. And this isn't just theoretical manipulation. It includes overt threats to victims that if they dare to disclose the violence, the perpetrator will tell their police colleagues that the victim is actually the abuser, or worse, make up false allegations against them.
Turning the tables completely.
Completely. We've seen this lead to truly perverse outcomes, like police-initiated intervention orders where the actual victim is wrongly listed as the affected family member.
Unbelievable.
One victim described this legal system as abuse as the ultimate form of coercive control, a strategy designed to ensure the victim always feels the police perpetrator will always have the upper hand, consistently leveraging their position and knowledge of the law to maintain power and control.
It's calculated exploitation.
Deeply calculated.
Hmm.
And it leaves victims trapped in this legal nightmare, often feeling completely powerless against the system itself.
Okay, so what we've laid out so far paints a pretty clear picture of how deeply interwoven this issue is with the very structure and culture of policing itself. Let's shift our focus now to the systemic failures and the broader gaps in police response to domestic and family violence generally, because these foundational issues disproportionately affect OIDV cases, making them even more perilous.
Right. The general context matters hugely here.
It does. First, let's talk about training and policy deficiencies. The sheer scale of domestic and family violence as a challenge for police is just staggering.
The numbers are huge.
Our sources highlight that it's not just part of police work. It's estimated to consume about 40% of general duties officers' time in the NSW police force. 40%.
That's almost half their time.
Exactly. And back in 2014, NSW police were reportedly dealing with around 370 incidents every single day.
Wow.
For something that takes up such an enormous amount of their resources, you would logically expect comprehensive, mandatory, and continuously updated training to be absolutely locked in place, wouldn't you?
You absolutely would. It seems like a basic requirement for the job.
But that's precisely where the critical gap lies, and it's a fundamental flaw that really surprised us in the sources. Despite the NSW police force having a wide range of detailed training material and comprehensive internal procedures available on their website.
So the materials exist.
The materials exist, but the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, the LECC, their review found a critical flaw. None of this training is mandatory.
None of it. Mandatory.
None. Think about that. If the procedures are detailed and comprehensive, designed to handle potentially life or death situations, but the training to actually implement them isn't compulsory, how can officers possibly be consistently equipped with the expertise and skills needed?
That makes no sense.
The LECC review specifically noted that some officers lacked the fundamental expertise and skills to carry out even basic investigative requirements, and they directly linked it to the optional nature of this vital training.
So it's not just an oversight. It's a recognized systemic vulnerability that puts victims directly at risk.
Absolutely. And the human toll on officers doing this incredibly difficult work is significant too, leading to what some research terms DV fatigue.
I can imagine.
Responding to domestic and family violence is identified as a distinct and substantial stressor for frontline police officers. This DFV-related stress can negatively impact officers' attitudes and even their own self-assessed performance.
The emotional burden must be immense.
Immense. And what's particularly fascinating, maybe even counterintuitive, from the research is the finding that higher stress was predicted not only by the frequency and severity of incidents, which you'd expect,
Right.
but also by the absence of lived experience as a victim survivor of domestic violence.
Really? So officers without personal experience found it more stressful.
That's what the data suggests, perhaps indicating they struggle more with empathy or effective intervention due to a lack of that direct understanding.
That's interesting.
Conversely, while negative attitudes were predicted by a shorter length of service, maybe due to initial disillusionment or shock, poorer performance actually correlated with a longer length of service and lower perceived social support within the force.
So experience didn't necessarily mean better performance if support wasn't there.
Exactly. This reveals complex systemic issues that inhibit effective police response issues that aren't just about individual officers, but about the relentless, often unsupported nature of the work itself. It shows the system isn't just failing victims sometimes, it's also impacting its own officers' ability to cope and perform effectively.
And this intensity, this pressure, often leads to what's been called the many hats problem, right?
Yes. Explain that.
Well, officers frequently find themselves simultaneously filling multiple, sometimes conflicting roles. They're expected to be a counselor one minute, an investigator the next, then a peacekeeper, then an evidence collector, all in the same incident.
That sounds exhausting and confusing.
It leads to significant role strain and can diminish effectiveness. Our sources suggest that this isn't principally caused by individual biases like gender bias, but rather by the immense pressure on frontline officers to, quote, solve DV and wear many hats.
The system puts them in that position.
Exactly. Creating these stress-inducing internal processes that almost set them up for failure sometimes. And this raises an important question about potential solutions, doesn't it?
Like what?
Could alternative approaches, maybe at recruiting and training more service-oriented police officers, specifically inclined towards community support and de-escalation help,
Or co-responder models.
or adopting those co-responder models we hear about, involving mental health nurses or social workers attending calls alongside officers? Could that truly alleviate this pressure?
It seems logical.
These models could potentially improve outcomes by allowing officers to focus more strictly on peacekeeping and law enforcement, while trained specialists handle the complex social and emotional support. It's about taking off some of those many hats and ensuring victims get the comprehensive, specialized care they need.
Which brings us to internal investigations and accountability. This is truly one of the most contentious aspects our sources highlight, and for very good reason.
The whole police investigating police issue.
Precisely. Critics argue vehemently that one of the inherent dangers is that, quote, too often alleged abusers are not being held accountable, putting victims' safety on the line.
It's not just a perceived conflict of interest, then.
No, it's a critical point that fundamentally erodes public trust in the entire system. When the very institution tasked with upholding justice is asked to investigate itself, particularly on such a sensitive matter, the public naturally questions the impartiality and the rigor of that investigation.
And we have concrete examples, right? Like the NSW Police Force's stance on transfers.
Yes, tell us about that.
Well, the LECC, the body designed to oversee police conduct, explicitly recommended that investigations into police officers for domestic violence offenses should be transferred to another command, just to avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest.
Seems sensible.
You'd think so. However, the NSW Police Force did not support this recommendation. They stated it's, quote, not always operationally practical.
Operationally practical.
That was the reasoning. Now, while they have implemented some changes, like requiring a senior officer, a PAC, or district inspector to attend incidents involving current or former members, verifying conflicts, developing new report forms the fundamental principle remains.
Colleagues investigating colleagues.
Or at least the investigation stays within the local command structure. This decision, despite the LECC's clear recommendation, leaves the door wide open to perceptions of bias and a lack of true independence. And it means victims often feel their cases just aren't handled fairly or thoroughly.
And the data on accountability, or maybe the lack of it, is stark, isn't it? It reveals a systemic problem that goes way beyond mere perception.
Absolutely.
Our sources reveal a significant disparity in charge rates and consequences for officers compared to the general public.
What are the numbers?
In 2021, for instance, the NSW police charge rate for family violence offenses was a mere 0.08% among over 17,000 officers.
0.08%.
Yes. Compare that to 0.42% for the broader community in NSW.
That's a huge difference, more than 5 times lower for police.
It raises an unavoidable, deeply troubling question. How equally is the law actually applied when the perpetrator wears a uniform? Furthermore, the sources show some really egregious examples. 3 NSW police senior constables were convicted of family violence offenses, and 3 others were found guilty in court. Yet, they retained their employment with the NSW police force.
They kept their jobs after convictions.
They kept their jobs. Let that sink in for a moment. This stands in incredibly sharp contrast to the general community, where such convictions can prevent someone from even volunteering for many organizations, let alone holding a position of public trust and authority.
It suggests a 2-tiered system of justice, plain and simple.
Undeniably.
Yeah.
A shocking difference in how consequences are meted out.
And the problem is compounded by what's accurately described as a self-investigative complaint system, which seems particularly noted in Victoria, according to the sources. The alarming lack of published data from police across the board is exacerbated by this very structure. Victim survivors of police-perpetrated violence often feel, quote, precluded from taking the direct pathway to the Police Professional Standards Command.
Why precluded?
Well, due to inherent conflicts of interest, they know the system is likely structured to protect its own, plus significant safety risks, and the pervasive perception that the institution may have already demonstrated inaction or bias in similar cases.
So they just don't trust the internal process.
They don't trust it, and they fear it. This creates an environment where victims are effectively deterred from seeking justice through the official channels, making accountability even more elusive and forcing victims into this impossible situation.
Given these pervasive systemic issues, it's no surprise there's an urgent and repeated call from victim survivors and advocates for a fundamental paradigm shift
Towards what?
toward truly independent investigation of OIDV. This means fundamentally taking the mechanisms that allow police to cover the backs of their colleagues entirely out of their hands.
Getting it outside the police force itself.
Completely. While Victoria, for example, launched a new unit back in December 2021, specifically to investigate internal domestic violence, aiming to eliminate conflicts of interest.
That sounds promising.
It does, but it's critically described by our sources as merely an appendage of the police.
Still attached.
Still attached, which implies it's still vulnerable to manipulation and internal influence, undermining its perceived independence. Similarly, the Tasmanian model, while it emphasizes independence, still leaves the final decisions with the police.
So not truly independent in the end.
It raises that incredibly important question for society. How can genuine accountability and victim safety truly be prioritized when investigations, in essence, remain within the sphere of the very institution being investigated?
It's a fundamental conflict of interest.
It is, and it needs to be resolved outside the force itself if we want to build real public trust and ensure victim safety.
Okay, moving from the systemic investigative failures, let's talk about a critical, truly life or death issue: firearms.
Yes, this is crucial.
A key measure designed to protect victims from immediate harm, as stipulated by law, is the swift removal of a defendant's firearms when an interim or provisional apprehended domestic violence order, an ADVO, is made.
That makes sense. Get the weapon out of the house.
Exactly. This automatically leads to the suspension of their firearms license. And if a final ADVO is issued, the license is revoked entirely, along with a 10-year ban on obtaining a new license. This is meant to be a fundamental safety mechanism,
Critical layer of protection.
offering a crucial layer of protection to victims by removing the most immediate and potentially lethal weapon from a volatile situation.
Yet our sources reveal alarming, almost unbelievable gaps when it comes to police officers' firearms.
Gaps how?
The LECC review found that out of 39 ADVO applications involving police officers, a shocking 92% included no information on what actions police had taken to secure the service firearms of the involved officers.
92%. No information.
No information recorded. Think about that.
Yeah.
This isn't a small oversight. It's a massive critical blind spot where a fundamental safety measure should be automatically triggered and documented.
It's a huge vulnerability.
It is. Furthermore, there's no formal, consistent process for how local commands even record the securing of service firearms. Individual commanders simply make their own ad hoc decisions.
So it's discretionary.
It appears to be largely discretionary, or at least inconsistently applied and recorded. This represents a significant and potentially deadly vulnerability, a glaring loophole in a system meant to protect the vulnerable. It's a procedural void where lives are literally at stake.
We have illustrative cases from our sources that highlight this critical failure with chilling clarity, don't we?
We do. Tell us about one.
Well, one case detailed how, despite a victim expressing extreme fear, the involved officer having documented aggression, and serious mental health issues being noted, all high-risk indicators according to the standard DVS-AT tool.
Red flags everywhere.
Absolutely. Despite all that, there was no clear information documented on when or how the service firearms were secured. The urgency just wasn't matched by formal procedure or recording.
Wow.
Another case study revealed a situation where police conducted checks and found an involved officer in lawful possession of 3 firearms stored at the home address shared with the victim.
Okay, so they found them.
They did. And while these firearms were seized in this instance and the storage was actually found to be inadequate,
Right.
the general lack of a formal mandated process for documenting this across the board is the profound concern here. It indicates a dangerous reliance on individual discretion rather than consistent, rigorous, and auditable procedures for something as high risk as firearms in a DV context involving an officer.
And this leads us tragically to the Edwards case. This is where the consequences of these systemic failures become just undeniably clear, impacting real lives in the most horrific way.
A truly heartbreaking example.
The John, Jack, and Jennifer Edwards case, specifically highlighted by the coroner's inquest, serves as a harrowing illustration. Despite multiple reports of domestic violence and assault on the children, direct warnings coming into the police.
Multiple reports.
Police recorded one incident as DV, no offense. They didn't list the children as victims on reports. They answered the Domestic Violence Safety Assessment Tool, the DVSEIT, questions incorrectly and, crucially, failed to record a child at risk, or CARAR incident.
Just mistake after mistake.
And adding profound insult to injury, the event report even included a shocking statement suggesting the victim's mother's report was a premeditated attempt to influence some future family court and divorce proceedings.
Blaming the victim.
Essentially. And most horrifyingly, amidst all this, there was no inquiry whatsoever into whether John Edwards, the perpetrator, possessed firearms.
They didn't even ask.
No record of it being asked or checked. Tragically, John Edwards then lawfully bought multiple rifles, a revolver, and a semi-automatic pistol after these incidents were reported and clearly mishandled by police.
After the reports.
On July 5, 2018, he used one of his legally bought firearms to fatally shoot his children, Jennifer and Jack, before taking his own life with another. 6 months later, Olga Edwards, the mother, unable to bear the unfathomable loss, also took her own life.
Utterly devastating.
While the coroner didn't blame any single agency, this case powerfully illustrates the devastating, irreversible consequences of inadequate record-keeping, flawed risk assessment, and critically, a failure of proactive firearms management by police.
It's a tragic testament to why these procedures need to be ironclad.
Absolutely. Especially concerning firearms and risk assessment. It shows what happens when the system fails at multiple points.
And beyond the critical issue of firearms, a fundamental bedrock of effective policing and victim support is just accurate and truthful record keeping, isn't it?
It sounds basic, but it's foundational.
Our sources emphasize that this isn't just about bureaucratic tidiness, it's absolutely foundational, not only for successfully prosecuting offenders, but also for sharing vital information with other agencies supporting victims' child protection, housing, counseling services.
It's the information pipeline.
It's the circulatory system of justice, really. If the information isn't flowing accurately and completely, the entire system becomes compromised. It leaves victims unsupported and perpetrators potentially unpunished.
Yet, the LECC review of those 102 sustained complaint investigations about police handling of domestic and family violence matters. It revealed widespread systemic deficiencies in this basic area.
Not just isolated incidents.
No, it was a clear pattern. For instance, 12 investigations involved officers failing to create notebook entries altogether, effectively erasing the initial contact.
First record, gone.
14 investigations found officers failing to create event reports in the system, meaning incidents just vanished from official records.
As if they never happened.
Exactly. And in a staggering 27 investigations, event reports that were created were either incomplete or contained actively misleading information.
Misleading how?
These breaches included critical failures, narratives differing wildly from victim statements, no mention of speaking to witnesses or any arrests made, failure to record multiple DV incidents reported against the same perpetrator, and crucially, often no mention of children being at risk or the victim expressing profound fear.
So the risk wasn't documented?
Often not. When the basic record is flawed or absent, the entire investigative process and the safety net for victims just collapses. It's truly shocking how often that fundamental first step in justice is missed or mishandled.
And there was a specific case study illustrating these risks, wasn't there?
Yes, vividly. It involved an officer's inexcusable failure to create an event report for a reported assault on a small child at a public play center.
Oh, no.
This oversight placed the child at, quote, serious risk of harm and nearly prevented the offender from being arrested and charged. The investigation rightly found this to be an inexcusable failure.
It's not just paperwork, is it? It's about child safety, potentially life and death.
Exactly. The accuracy and completeness of initial reports directly dictate whether victims, especially vulnerable children, receive the protection they desperately need and whether perpetrators are held accountable. The consequences of such negligence are just dire.
And it's not just about what's written down, but also what's captured, like video evidence.
Right. The importance of obtaining statements from all persons who can provide information, including victims, of course, but also crucial witnesses like neighbors, is continually emphasized in our sources.
Because victims might withdraw statements.
Exactly. Police cannot and should not rely solely on victim evidence, especially if victims later withdraw statements due to fear, coercion, or the pervasive threat of further abuse. Independent corroboration is vital.
Makes sense.
Additionally, the review found significant issues with body-worn video, or BWV. Officers often deactivated them too early, failing to fully capture incidents as they unfolded.
Why would they do that?
The review doesn't always say why, but the effect is clear. This is vital footage for accountability, especially when there are claims of unlawful police actions or questions about police conduct on the scene. Missing footage means missing crucial evidence, and it's a critical loss of transparency.
Which leads us to another really difficult area: the devastating impact of misidentification in domestic violence cases.
Getting it wrong about who the primary aggressor is.
Exactly. While domestic and family violence is multi-layered, and we know women are predominantly victims and men the most common perpetrators, the reality on the ground can be complex.
How so?
Well, women can use violence too, sometimes self-defensive violence, sometimes retaliatory violence after prolonged abuse, and this can unfortunately complicate the immediate identification of the primary aggressor for officers arriving at a chaotic scene.
And other complexities.
Furthermore, LGBTIQ individuals also experience domestic violence, often with unique dynamics, adding another layer of complexity to identification that police officers may not be adequately trained or equipped to navigate. This can lead to potentially harmful misjudgments.
And the consequences of this misidentification are dire, aren't they?
Wow.
And deeply unjust.
Absolutely. Police sometimes incorrectly identify the victim as the primary aggressor. Now, this doesn't necessarily constitute a breach of procedure in itself if they follow the steps but reach the wrong conclusion.
But the outcome for the victim.
The consequences for victims can be devastating, including wrongful prosecutions and convictions. This isn't a minor procedural error. It contributes directly to the criminalization of many victim survivors of family violence, particularly Aboriginal women, immigrant women, and women of color, who are already disproportionately represented and often face systemic biases within the justice system.
So it actively punishes those who are already suffering.
Re-victimizing them within the very legal system meant to protect them.
And in cases of OIDV, this potential for misidentification or deliberate manipulation of identification becomes even more insidious, right?
It does, because police perpetrators can actively and strategically use their insider knowledge of the system to undermine their victims' credibility.
Yeah.
They often draw on insidious gendered stereotypes, portraying the victim as the crazy or unfit mother, for instance, to deflect blame onto them and paint themselves as the victim or the reasonable party.
Using stereotypes to manipulate colleagues.
Precisely. One victim recounted being charged with assault occasioning an actual bodily harm based on a minor injury. Her ex-police officer partner claims she inflicted a mark she, chillingly, actually saw him create himself.
Oh my God. Self-inflicted to frame her.
Exactly. Another described this legal systems abuse as the ultimate form of coercive control, where the police perpetrator aims to ensure the victim always feels they will always have the upper hand, manipulating the very justice system to maintain power and control long after the relationship might have ended.
It places an unbearable burden on the actual victim.
An impossible burden, often. To prove the perpetrator's misconduct and identify the conflicts of interest within the police force, tasks that are nearly impossible for someone outside the system, especially when they are battling trauma and abuse from a knowledgeable insider. It's a terrifying testament to the power an abuser in uniform wields.
Okay, so after laying bare these pervasive and deeply troubling systemic issues, the culture, the lack of training, the accountability gaps, the firearms issues, the record keeping, the misidentification. Let's try to pivot to the pathways forward that our sources recommend.
Is there hope for change?
Well, the good news, if you can call it that, is that the NSW police force itself does acknowledge the significant proportion of its workload dedicated to domestic and family violence incidents. Remember that 40% figure.
Right.
And they have proposed significant changes to how they manage and investigate these matters. The LECC, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, has also made 13 specific recommendations to strengthen procedures.
So there is at least some recognition of the problem from within the system.
There is recognition, yes. Whether the proposed changes and accepted recommendations go far enough or are implemented effectively remains the question.
And a crucial part of moving forward surely involves training, right? Getting that fixed.
Absolutely. Research strongly supports that specifically targeted and regular training significantly improves domestic violence investigations. It's not rocket science.
So the LECC must have recommended mandatory training.
They did. Given the complexity and sheer volume of these cases, the LECC recommends that all training related to domestic and family violence should be mandatory.
Finally.
It's stated as an imperative that cannot be overstated. This mandatory training needs to be comprehensive, covering the application of domestic violence standard operating procedures, including critical aspects like child protection protocols, effective victim support strategies, immediate firearm removal procedures, and strict ADVO compliance checks.
All the basics done right.
And more. It also needs to delve into the nuanced complexities of domestic and family violence incidents themselves, the crucial identification and sensitive management of mental health issues for all parties involved, and critically, the correct identification of the primary aggressor and the primary victim to prevent those devastating misidentifications we just discussed.
Getting that right is fundamental.
Absolutely. Furthermore, training must include rigorous verification of the ATOPS system event reports related to domestic and family violence, ensuring accuracy, and essential cross-cultural training to prepare officers for the specific needs of diverse population groups, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, especially given that NSW police only started recording Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander status in CAPS from June 2022.
That late. Wow. Okay, so a holistic approach to training is vital.
It really is, for creating a truly competent, consistent, and compassionate police response.
And beyond training, strengthening accountability and transparency seems paramount too.
Definitely. The LECC recommends that risk assessments for domestic violence incidents be maintained on a centralized database. This creates a comprehensive, accessible record across commands.
Good. And the firearms.
Critically, these assessments must include specific, detailed information on how and when firearms are secured. For service firearms, the weapons officers carry for their job. Event reports should explicitly document the date and time of securing, the precise location where it was secured, the name and rank of the officer who secured it, and the date and time of its return.
A clear, formal, auditable process.
Exactly, which is currently lacking, relying on those informal decisions by individual commanders, which, as we saw so tragically with the Edwards case, leaves dangerous, potentially fatal gaps.
And accountability for performance.
Yes. There's also a clear need identified for rigorous performance assessment for officers, especially those in leadership roles. Their performance specifically related to domestic violence incidents needs to be explicitly reviewed and counted for.
Holding commanders responsible.
Ensuring that those in command are held directly responsible for the effectiveness or lack thereof of their teams in these critical situations. Accountability cannot be an optional extra. It must be built into the very fabric of the system, from top to bottom.
Now, while police are often the first responders and improving their response is critical, our sources repeatedly emphasize a broader fundamental truth, don't they?
They do, which is?
That family violence is not an issue that can be solved by police alone. It is a community issue and requires a community response.
It's bigger than just policing.
Much bigger. This means that addressing the root causes of domestic violence extends far beyond law enforcement reform. It fundamentally includes challenging deeply ingrained cultural attitudes towards women in society, attitudes which are identified in the sources as underlying causes of male violence.
So police respond to symptoms, but society needs to address the disease.
That's a good way to put it. Dismantling patriarchal attitudes, challenging misogyny, fostering true gender equality, that's the deeper work required for long-term change.
And here's a particularly fascinating and perhaps uncomfortable connection that emerges from the research, tying these broader societal issues right back to individual experiences, specifically childhood experiences.
Okay, what's the connection?
International research indicates that experiencing physical punishment as a child significantly increases the likelihood of both being a victim of and perpetrating intimate partner violence as an adult.
Wow. A direct link from childhood punishment to adult IPV.
A documented link. It's a sobering cycle. The Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the RATCP, issued a powerful position statement on this very issue. They directly linked childhood physical punishment to a whole range of severe negative outcomes later in life. Mental health problems, aggressive behavior, substance use, and, disturbingly, quote, abuse of their own children or spouse.
So the cycle continues across generations.
Potentially, yes. This raises a critical and perhaps uncomfortable question for all of us about how society's attitudes towards child discipline, what we consider acceptable forms of punishment for children, might intersect with the broader domestic violence crisis.
You mean, could changing how we treat children impact DV rates later?
Could early intervention on this front, through a profound societal shift away from physical punishment towards positive parenting, actually influence the future prevalence of all forms of domestic violence, including OIDV, decades down the line?
It's a truly provocative thought about prevention on a generational scale.
It suggests that the roots of violence can run very, very deep, perhaps starting much earlier than we often consider.
And ultimately, despite these broader societal factors, the consistent, resounding message from victim-survivor experiences and the comprehensive research we've looked at points back to that urgent need for systemic change within policing itself.
which is
A paradigm shift toward independent investigation.
back to independence.
Back to independence. This means fundamentally taking the mechanisms that currently allow police to potentially cover the backs of their colleagues entirely out of their hands. The current internal systems, even with newly created internal units like Victoria's, are viewed with suspicion because they remain essentially an appendage of the police.
Still part of the same body.
Exactly. Still potentially vulnerable to manipulation or internal biases. Even the Tasmanian model, which emphasizes independence more, still leaves the final decisions ultimately with the police, which undermines true impartiality in the eyes of many victims and advocates.
So it raises that inescapable question of genuine independence, doesn't it?
It does. To achieve true organizational and perpetrator accountability, and most importantly, to truly prioritize victim-survivor safety, there seems to be a clear need for adequate funding for truly independent oversight bodies.
Bodies outside the police structure entirely.
Entirely. These bodies must offer a legitimate, trusted, and alternative investigative avenue for OIDV allegations, crucially with final decision-making power residing definitively outside the police force itself. This is seen by many and absolutely essential for breaking cycles of impunity and finally ensuring something closer to real justice for victims.
So wrapping this up, we've taken a really deep dive today into the complex and, frankly, often distressing reality of domestic and family violence, particularly when it tragically involves police officers.
A tough but necessary dive.
Absolutely. We've seen how pervasive this issue is, how it's often hidden from public view, and the unique, almost unimaginable vulnerabilities faced by victims when their abuser is part of the very law enforcement system meant to protect them.
The ultimate betrayal of trust.
It really is. We've meticulously explored the systemic failures from that inadequate and non-mandatory training, the shockingly poor record-keeping, to the inherent challenge of internal investigations and that critical, life-threatening issue of firearms management.
And the cultural factors underpinning it all.
Yes, and the broader societal factors too, like entrenched police culture and even the long-term echoes of childhood experiences. And woven throughout, we've heard the urgent, repeated calls for truly independent oversight and profound cultural change, both within policing and society more broadly.
The sources we've explored really highlight that while the police are often the first point of contact for domestic violence incidents, this is fundamentally not a problem that can be solved by police alone.
It takes a village, as they say.
It really is a societal problem requiring a multifaceted community response. The ongoing effort to improve police responses is undeniably vital. It's a necessary step, absolutely.
Yeah.
But just as vital is acknowledging the deep-seated cultural issues within police forces and the persistent challenges of achieving true accountability when institutions are largely left to police themselves. The gaps in data we talked about, the apparent reluctance to fully implement recommended reforms, and the chilling effect on victims and support agencies, they all speak to a profound, urgent need for systemic transformation that goes far beyond any single department or policy tweak.
So what does all of this mean for you, the listener, and for us as a society? Here's something to think about. If the very institutions designed to protect and serve struggle so profoundly with accountability and transparency within their own ranks regarding such a critical life and death issue, what does that imply about the nature of justice itself in our society?
A confronting question.
It is. And what role do you play in demanding that transparency, in advocating for truly independent systems that protect everyone, especially the most vulnerable whose abusers hold positions of power? This isn't just about police reform, is it?
No, it's much broader.
It's about the kind of society we want to live in. One where trust and safety are paramount for all, regardless of who holds power or wears a uniform. It demands us to look beyond the headlines, to ask difficult questions about the foundations of our protective institutions, and to consider how we can collectively build a future where every single individual feels safe and believed, regardless of who their abuser might be.